Kamisato Ayato has finally arrived in Genshin, so in this video, I will showcase to you all of his teams, weapons, and artifacts I tested out, as well as talk about some of the important things that I honestly think you should know about him if you're interested in pulling for this boba tea enthusiast. So before we begin, keep in mind all of this footage you're about to see is from Hoyoverse's special media server that I've spent roughly a week inside, learning everything there is to know about Constellation Zero Ayato. Now with this out of the way, I want to first focus on exploring his elemental skill, which when activated, will override Ayato's normal attacks with Hydro Infusion, provide him with new damage multipliers, and in result, he gains these fast and wide normal attacks that look really cool, and you can just hold down the attack button to keep spamming the skill until the duration ends. He also leaves behind a water clone which explodes and deals damage to surrounding enemies, but I'll get back to it a bit later. Oh, and whenever I talk about his normal attacks in this video, always assume it's the ones from his skill because the actual normal attacks have very little to do with him, as you can see from the talents I've leveled on him. Now, normally if you time it right, 15 hits will be unleashed, and if we assume this is a level 9 skill, this results in about 1623% damage multiplier, which is honestly pretty big with all things considered. You are, however, going to be left in a vulnerable position open to enemy attacks if you're not utilizing Ayato in freeze teams, which means if he's not shielded, he might get knocked around by enemies, even after he gains resistance to interruption, so don't expect to unleash all 15 hits every single time. Moving on, the other thing I want to quickly go over are the Nami Sense stacks he gains when using his skill, which will provide a slight boost to his infused normal attack damage based on his maximum HP, and you can get a total of 4 stacks. Now the way you gain them is by hitting the enemies, however, his first passive skill always gives him 2 stacks when he activates the skill, and 2 more after his clone explodes. I don't know if it's a bug on my media server, but the clone is supposed to explode when there are enemies nearby based on the skill's description, which he doesn't do that, so you never gain those 2 stacks because the water clone explodes right at the same time as the skill's infusion ends. So realistically speaking, I always started out with 2 Nami Sense stacks, and after a couple of hits, I had all 4 of them and wouldn't pay too much attention to this overly complicated mechanic. I honestly feel like Hoyoverse kind of dropped the ball on this Nami Sense stack mechanic when I guarantee you won't even pay attention to them 99% of the time because of how easy and unnoticeable it is to just have them at max 4 stacks with no effort. On the other hand, his burst is pretty simple and is almost identical to Ganyu's burst, since he will create a big field of raindrops that land on enemies and deal small amount of damage, which can become a bit more deadly if you group the enemies into one place, because now that same raindrop will damage all of nearby enemies, so naturally, this burst has really good synergy with Venti. It's also important to know that the burst snapshots, while the elemental skill does not, so casting the burst after something like Benny's or Kujosara's attack boost is a good idea, since it will retain that boost for all 18 seconds of its duration. Also, standing inside the field will boost normal attack damage by up to 20%, including Ayato himself, which is not a big deal, but a nice to have buff. But talking more about his playstyle is unavoidable without some teammates involved, so let's move on to his showcasing. Now before I talk about all of the teams and rotations I've tested with Ayato, always keep an eye on the bottom of the screen here to see the stats, artifacts, and weapons I'm using on him, because I went through many different loadouts just to see how good he is. Also, most of the testing was done against Rift Hounds on the final floor of the Abyss, which means they take less damage from him, provide not a lot of energy, and are really agile. So while the conditions are tough, I think this reveals his potential pretty well in less than favorable situations. Now, I want to first begin by taking a closer look at his Hydro application. Most of you know at this point, Hydro as an element is almost essential for any kind of strong team comp, and this is why you see this element in almost every meta team build. And so the first thing that's important to address is Ayato's burst. So I've tested his burst Hydro application with almost every pyro character, and I can tell you with enough confidence that no, it's not good for characters like Diluc, Hu Tao, and Yoimiya to vaporize their main attacks, because it's not reliable enough for someone like Hu Tao to do charged vape attacks and results in only getting 3 or 4 vapes before she overrides the enemy with her own pyro application, and the same can be said about basically any other pyro character. However, when it comes to freeze and electro charge teams, the burst's Hydro application works just fine. But the good news are, his elemental skill Hydro application is pretty good. In fact, when using him in an international team variation with Xiangling, she will be able to vaporize her Pyronado consistently when Ayato is doing his infused normal attacks, although on startup, it will still be 2 or 3 Pyronado hits that won't vaporize at first. So while you can do it, there are some trade-offs. Still, using him him instead of Child in this meta team comp did prove to be a good alternative option, and I was able to clear the chambers in about the same time as I would with Child, sometimes even faster, because if you're going up against a single target, Ayato's damage is actually better than Child's infused Hydro attacks. But that's mostly because Child is insane with multiple targets when he applies his Riptide marks. Overall, I'm happy with this team outcome, but keep in mind you need to optimize energy recharge for both Ayato and Xiangling quite a lot to have consistent rotations, and more importantly, double swirling with Kazuha is almost impossible due to how Ayato needs to apply Hydro, which is why I want to talk about his burst cost and the way I am managing his energy. Now, if you're unaware, he does have a nice passive that provides him with 2 energy points per second if he's off-field and below 40 energy. From my observations, if I start the rotation with his burst and then switch to every other team member before going back to him, this results in about 6 to 8 seconds downtime, so it's about 12 to 16 energy total, but there will be some cases where you do his burst and skill immediately, essentially rendering this passive useless. And the thing about his energy is that when using the skill, he will create 1 or 2 particles for a total of 3 times, so on average, it will be about 4.5 particles, and that's not a lot, especially with such a huge cost attached to his burst. And because of this, if you rely on his burst, then you'll probably want to activate his skill 2 times, which means making some weird adjustments to rotations. Like for example, the cooldown on the skill is 12 seconds, but using those infused normal attacks lasts for 6 seconds. So it's really 6 seconds of remaining skill cooldown. So then you switch to maybe 1 or 2 teammates, apply some buffs, and switch back to him to activate the skill for the second time, followed by his burst that you hopefully have now fully recharged. I am still trying to find the sweet spot for how much ER he needs, but I can tell you that anything above 140% is acceptable, while 170% and above makes it really comfortable to activate his burst off cooldown, and you can sometimes get away with this by just using his skill once. But going back to his teams, he seems to work just fine in different freeze variations, whether it's Ganyu or Ayaka utilized as the heavy hitter. However, since Ayato requires significant field time for his skill and he doesn't provide powerful buffs and utilities, like Mona with her Omen buff, Thrilling Tales, and even Tenacity Artifact, or Kokomi who can do almost the same stuff except instead of Omen buff, she heals, you really are just using Ayato for his Hydro application and personal damage from his skill. So this means for freeze variations, I found it's best to include Diona for healing along with Noblesse Forced as well as Venti, so that Ayato's raindrops can deal more damage on grouped enemies. I'm not sure what to think about Kamisato's sibling combination because without buffs, Ayaka's burst damage is significantly weaker, and you kind of need to rectify this situation with Ayato's personal damage, which I guess it kind of mixes things up a little, and I could still see good results, but nothing amazing in particular. But overall, freeze teams are great with Ayato, especially since you can use on him Blizzard's Strayer set that essentially provides 55% critical rate if we take into account Cryo Resonance, and with this, you could see some really good results when using weapons like Harbinger of Dawn, Amenoma Kageyuchi, or Mistsplitter. Now, I did get surprised with Electro Charge team variations. Ayato feels very natural in them. He works pretty nicely with Beto, just keep in mind his skill, again, only lasts for 6 seconds, and then you need to keep unloading those discharges in a different way, and since you're not using Xingqiu or Kokomi, the team's survivability nosedives, and it only makes me wish Hoyoverse finally released an Electro Healer, because I'm not desperate enough to start using Prototype Amber. I also tried out some variations of what I call Hyper Ayato, where my only focus is to maximize on his normal attack damage, and yeah, I could get up to 40 to 50k critical hits, and they felt nice, but the cost to achieve this greatness inside the Abyss is painful to say the least, especially when Yunjin is involved and how awkward it becomes to maintain everything in cohesion. However, after making one small adjustment, I discovered a team that I personally believe to be not just fun, but also really strong. In fact, I would say that it's possible this will become a new meta team. So, the secret ingredient here is Fischl, or C6 Fischl in my case. Not only does she help out with energy issues thanks to her last constellation, but her electro application from Oz, coupled with Ayato's burst and skill, results in consistent electro charge reactions that can be easily swirled by Kazuha or Sucrose, and even if there is someone like Benny, he won't mess up the elemental reactions too much after using his abilities. And just looking at this beautiful scene right here, you can witness the amount of chaos and damage you can cause with this team comp. I mean, let's be honest here, this isn't really a groundbreaking innovation, since this team variation has been before Ayato and it's called Fireworks, and it worked pretty well with Child, but Ayato works so well here that this will probably be my main favorite team to use in the Abyss. So here's what I think so far about Boba T Kamisato. I think he's great. In fact, I believe he is a balanced character, and something that I haven't talked about are the vast amounts of loadout options he has. You've seen 4 artifact sets showcased so far: Gladiators, Heart of Death, Echoes of Offering, and Blizzard's Share. All of them work great, and I know that you can also use on him Thundering Fury 4 set in Electro Charge teams, but I don't have it farmed up, although the point I'm trying to make is that you can slap on him any of these sets, except for maybe Blizzard's Share if you're not using him in freeze teams, and you're good to go. I actually don't think Echoes of Offering is worth farming for, and instead, if you have Gladiators or you have spent some time in the Dragonspine domain, these sets are more than enough to substitute months of resin you would otherwise need to spend on Echoes of Offering. And regarding his signature weapon, while it's good on him, if you have Jade Cutter or Mist Splitter, to me they felt almost on equal terms. Maybe the new signature weapon would beat them by a slight margin in a few team comps, but unless you don't have any of these 5-star swords, even something like Skyward Blade, I wouldn't recommend pulling for this weapon, but it's entirely up to you what you wish to do with your Primo Gems. Now, I also want to mention quickly his free-to-play option, Amenoma Kageuchi, because I found it to be not only great in freeze teams, but it also worked as an excellent energy supplier, since if you trigger his skill 2 times, you can get back to up to 24 energy at max refinement, and that reduces his energy requirements by quite a lot. There's also Harbinger of Dawn, which kind of suffers against corrosion, but overall works great in freeze teams. And as for his best 4-star weapon, I would say hands down Black Sword is amazing on him. It almost feels like it's tailor-made for this guy because it boosts his normal attack damage, provides critical rate, and even heals him. I'll talk more about his weapon ranking in the upcoming guide video, so make sure to subscribe to my channel to not miss out on it. I also want to quickly mention his constellations. Since I showcased to you his C0 potential, I never felt like I needed more for him except maybe better energy generation, but you won't find this improvement on any of his constellations. Everything here is just to upgrade his damage, so if you think he needs to do bigger hits, well, you can improve that. Overall, I would say that it takes a little bit getting used to Ayato's playstyle, especially if you want to master his energy recharge and rotations, so I'm not sure if everyone's going to appreciate him. Although, one thing we rarely talk about is how hard it is to perfect someone like Hu Tao, and yet she has a huge fan base. So I feel like the same is going to be with Ayato. He is quite complex, there's definitely a learning curve to him, but when you pull off a beautiful, or should I say graceful rotation, it feels extremely rewarding. Couple this with the fact he has lots of equipment options to go for, some cheap, some expensive, and you'll probably always find something that makes him slightly deal more damage. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'd really appreciate if you could subscribe to my channel and leave a like to help with YouTube's algorithm. More videos about Ayato coming soon, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.